What's up, Coordination? On the pod today, we've got Nadia Asparouhova, who is a personal hero of mine, did a lot of work at GitHub in the mid-2010s on open source sustainability, which is a coordination failure that I think Nadia's work, I would be safe to say, led to the founding of Gitcoin for me. A lot of the work that we've done at Gitcoin is built on top of the research and the thinking that came out of that era, of which Nadia had a huge part of. On the pod today, we talk about mapping out digital tribes, and we talk about Nadia's work as a writer and a former independent researcher at Protocol Labs. Nadia is not crypto native, but she is an author, a thinker, and someone that I have looked up to for a long time. So I think that you're really going to enjoy this episode, Coordination. Without further ado, I'll give you Nadia Asparouhova.
Working in Web3 is awesome, but working outside of the typical W-2 employee structure is a deal breaker for so many. Opolis is helping the self-sovereign worker focus on what they do best, their work. Tax time is coming up. Opolis helps professionalize your business by helping you form an entity, generate proof of employment through pay stubs, and receive a W-2 at the end of the tax year. Are you self-employed and forced to spend money on expensive healthcare insurance with limited coverage? Opolis leverages group buying power through a community employment co-op, helping you save 20 to 50% on high-quality, affordable healthcare options through Cigna. And finally, Opolis' member owners share in Opolis' success and profits based on their work token holdings. You must be authorized to work inside the United States in select Canadian provinces to receive Opolis' benefits. Book a 30-minute free consultation with Opolis' experts and join Opolis by March 31st, 2023 to get 1,000 work and 1,000 bank tokens. Go to connect.opolis.co/bankless to get started. And if you're going to ETH Denver, make sure to stop by the Opolis booth or attend their Future of Work Summit hosted by Opolis. The Glow dollar is a new stablecoin with a very special property. As the market cap of Glow goes up, extreme poverty goes down. Glow is a dollar-backed, non-profit stablecoin that creates basic income for people living in extreme poverty. Glow is basically the same business model as USDC, with yield-generating treasuries on one side and a stablecoin on Ethereum on the other. But instead of being a for-profit company, Glow is a non-profit that donates 100% of all yields from the Glow Reserve to Give Directly's basic income program. Give Directly is a charity that gives people money, no strings attached, to people living in poverty, and is a charity that Vitalik has previously donated to and supported in the past. With Glow, you can reduce poverty just by holding a stablecoin. Glow is launching in early 2023, and you can join the waitlist at glowdollar.org/greenpill. That's glodollar.org/greenpill.
Nadia, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
I'm pretty good. It's been a dream for a long time to have you on the podcast. I think I was telling you before we were recording that a lot of my early work at Gitcoin was inspired by your work on open source funding and sustainability at GitHub. So really honored to have you here.
Yeah, it's awesome to get a chance to talk.
So I was doing my research at nadia.xyz for this episode, and you're just so prolific. You have thought about so many different things relating to our present age, and I'm curious. Well, in figuring out where we wanted to dive in, I guess maybe I'll frame it this way: what's most present for you right now? What are you spending your waking hours thinking about right now?
I'm spending a lot of time. My head is basically around trying to understand tech's growing social and political influence outside of just being a business industry, outside of startups. So how will sort of like tech values exit just, living in the enclave of Silicon Valley and starting to influence the world in these sort of bigger ways. So that has driven the direction of a lot of the things I've explored this past year.
Got it. Can you say more about, well, so actually I recently just watched a video. You were on the Stoa where you're giving a talk about mapping digital worlds and why it's important, different methodologies for tribe mapping. So maybe we could talk a little bit about mapping digital worlds, and then I'm curious from there, what are the different tribes you think that are within Silicon Valley and tech and its cultural influence, and maybe pushing against Silicon Valley's influence or
Sure.
tech's influence in writ large?
Yeah, those are big topics, but I think the digital tribe mapping was sort of my attempt to try to hone or zoom out or articulate this kind of methodology that I find myself coming back to over and over again. I think I did versions of that with my open source research, but then in the last year, I've been trying to kind of refine that more, which is, so if you think about sort of like in physical spaces, we have cartography, we have once upon a time, people did not have maps of the world, and they had to go out and figure out how to draw those maps. And the act of creating those maps also helped, both extend power over communities that were maybe like not wanting to be mapped, or were now on someone's map and could now be sort of like cataloged and measured and tracked. But also, I think, like legitimize power for even those kinds of communities and groups where if you're on a map, you mean something, right? And I think looking at sort of like digital spaces, and I really do believe there's like, like the digital world is on this sort of like parallel journey to where the physical world was. I see it as, equal or greater in importance. There are very few maps about some of the most important things in our digital spaces right now. Communities that kind of go unseen or untracked or not understood. And I don't mean tracking in the sense of putting them on a, dashboard and measuring their, I don't know, community member growth or something like that. Not that kind of tracking, but just when you see these kinds of communities enter mainstream political conversations or reported on the news, like there's just like a clear lack of understanding of what they even are. I think the most prominent example right now is around seeing sort of like effective altruism and a lot of ideas that came from sort of rationalist community now start to break into the mainstream. Like for me, it has been a trip to see Eliezer, referenced now in like very mainstream media. But people are constantly trying to put them in these buckets of the like physical analog world of, left, right, liberal, conservative, whatever. And it's confusing and it's inaccurate. And I think we could do a much better job at figuring out how to map these digital territories in a way that is legible to other people. But I think that's still, it's similar but different in some ways to physical mapping. And that was the methodology I was trying to sort of unpack in that talk that you mentioned.
Yeah. Well, the thing I feel about physical mapping is that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and you can look at a map of a territory and understand so much that it would take words and words of text in order to do. And unfortunately, I can't share screen in order to show it, but your talk at the STOA has lots of examples of mapping out digital spaces as though they're physical spaces, and it lends to a lot of understandability, I think, with those spaces. So we'll link that in the show notes so that people can check it out.
Cool.
I'm wondering, so how that applies to your current thinking about tech's influence on the world. If there was a map of tech and its changing influence on the world, which maps help you understand that the best, and how do you sort of conceptualize that? How's that research going?
Yes, like I think like within the world of tech, you can just maybe starting there. There are a lot of let's say like intellectual movements or communities that have informed a lot of people's values in tech, and downstream of that, people have created companies influenced by those values, or they have sort of like spread those ideas in various forms. And so you think about effective altruism being kind of one of those, or I think maybe more specifically rationalist community being kind of one of the origins of that. But there's a lot of other versions of that. I think like progress studies and the notion of just sort of like creating abundance is like another one of those influential communities in recent years. And so I've been trying to kind of both understand the shape of each of those movements, and then also understand like how what do they have in common, and how are they also like influencing what tech means and how we even like articulate it to the rest of the world, to someone who's not in tech. And there, I think a lot of things that people take for granted working in tech that are not well understood by outsiders. And so, I think there's like, one aspect of that of just trying to map out like what are all these different driving forces or pockets of idea generation that have existed in tech and are continuing to influence it. I wrote a piece last year called, I think I just called it Idea Machines, but this notion of like a framework of how people turn ideas into outcomes, and how an idea machine, and in my sort of conception of it, is composed of a few different pieces, but like there's like a community, and that community starts to articulate its values, but with the presence of like funders can lead to those ideas start turning into an agenda, which turns into action, et cetera. So that has been sort of one piece of just like articulating those ideas that are serving as an engine for driving progress and change. But then zooming out more broadly, I guess I've been looking in particular at sort of like, what is the status quo right now of how we talk about, particularly I think in my case or in my interests, like American values. What does America care about right now? How do we act accordingly to those values? And where does tech fit into that? And I see right now there's like a sort of growing conflict between two generations of values, I guess, that are driven by the elites or the beneficiaries of each of those values. And so on the one hand, you have the sort of Wall Street finance, like Davosian set of values that cropped up in towards the end of the 90s with the birth of the internet that has one way of looking at the world and has really influenced a lot of our public institutions right now, media, academia, government. And then you have sort of like Silicon Valley as the rising challenger to that in some ways, or at least some pockets of it are, which have like a different set of values. And sort of like, where are those clashes starting to happen is I would hope as someone in tech who really loves tech, that those values can be also encoded into our public institutions, but I don't see that happening as much as I would like it to right now. Yeah.
Wow, that was amazing. There's so many places that I want to
There's
pull
like
a thread,
but on my head right now. So.
Yeah. And, knowing you, I'm sure there'll be a book or a blog post where if people want to learn more, they can. But what comes up for me is, when I almost felt like as you were speaking that I was feeling a meditation on tribalism and how tribal the internet has become over its evolution over the last several years and the power centers. And to me, when I think about American values, my first idea of the polarity comes from MAGA, what I'm going to reductionistly call the Make America Great, the right, and then the left, which I think would pejoratively be called the woke by the right. And those are kind of like the tribal echo chambers that people consume different news. They have different common knowledge. They have different value sets. And so it's interesting for me to hear you say that the New York elite and the Silicon Valley elite are sort of the opposite tribes. And to me, I want to transpose that into almost like a 2x2 matrix of woke, MAGA, Silicon Valley, Wall Street / Davos. And this is only mapping the elite. Of course, there's people who are outside of the elite. And yeah, I don't know. I guess what's your reaction to that? I guess we're talking about where there's capital tribalization, not just like social value tribalization here.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm trying really hard to avoid getting embroiled in sort of like the political
culture wars.
Yeah. Because I think there's something much deeper going on. And I think the reason why I've sort of focused on like elites as, as this sort of driving but often under discussed form of cultural force behind cultural production. So I think we talk a lot about sort of like bottoms up, like grassroots movements as driving cultural production historically, but we ignore that, like, a lot of those movements were funded by like other people with interests. And I think like the ways in which people make their money really influence how they care about sort of like influencing the world. And so I think like, for me, it's less about sort of like MAGA versus woke or something like that, and more about like, how do you think change happens in the world? So like the Davos group, I think, is much more focused on like globalism, for example. And so it's like taking whatever the best of America is at the time. I think it's like, liberal democracy, and spreading that throughout the rest of the world. And it's sort of like this paternalistic view of like, we have the best form of government and we're just going to sort of like repeat it everywhere else. Whereas I think what we see from a lot of people in tech is that like America is the place where like we are supposed to be attracting the very best of talent, and we're giving them like one single location that benefits from these network effects to bring everyone to one place. And so that naturally leads to where in the Davos case, it's sort of like de-emphasizing America. It's de-emphasizing this sort of like national identity in favor of this like uniform global identity that kind of like papers over what makes different cultures distinct or unique. On the Silicon Valley side of things, I think it is actually like revitalizing America and bringing a focus back to America as, and I've written about this with the network state piece, but whether it's literally America or it's some metaphor of like a single place where people come to, or a single reference point that everyone has, as like, this is a place where you can go to like have unbounded opportunities, to have unconstrained ambition, to like explore your ideas to the fullest. And that, to me, that's not really like a purely political difference in the sense of, Democrat, Republican kind of politics, but it's much more like, how do you actually think the world changes.
Yeah.
And similarly, I think there's also something around like this sort of founder mindset of startup culture that really leads us to prize like individuals versus the sort of efficient measurement kind of oriented mindset of finance types that leads them to be more like um, to just sort of like prize like institutions and systems.
Amazing. The meme that came to my mind as you were saying that was Ronald Reagan's meme of a shining city on a hill. America is a shining city on the hill, like a Schelling point for talent and capital and stuff like that. And I wonder if you think that's a fair meme to apply to the Silicon Valley talent magnet vision that you just articulated.
Yeah, I mean, I would like us to have something that is a shining city on the hill, right? And again, like I see America as almost like a metaphor for that. But like you go anywhere in the world, and people will say like, America is the place to go, right? Like we all globally have some understanding of like there is a place I can go where maybe my peers around me sort of like discourage my ideas or tell me that I should just put my head down and focus on my boring job that is really unfulfilling. But like I know if I go to America, like that opportunity is unlocked somehow. And whether America is living up to that right now is like a separate question. But I think it's important that we all have that like shared belief in a place. And I think it is possible that in some future iteration of this, then it may not be literally America, the nation state, but it's like America in some like digital form that transcends a physical location. I don't really know what that looks like eventually, but.
Okay. Well, I'm wondering if, this is a podcast that goes out to people who are into crypto and who are focused on crypto for social good, environmental good, and sort of like community good, which I know that the crypto space is not known for. So we're sort of like a niche within a niche, regen crypto. And I guess I'm wondering, not because this conversation needs to be crypto focused, but I just want to like place it on the map where you think crypto and decentralized finance fits between in the white space between these two elites, or where it is in the taxonomy for you, if anywhere at all.
Well, I think, or I hope at least, and I think it's still an early evolving conversation, but I hope that it is maybe like the third piece in that timeline. If we had, to me, like sort of the Davos Late is the past or in decline, I think the like Silicon Valley version of that is ascendant or sort of in the current conversation. And I think the future of that might look like whatever that sort of transition is to America as a digital state or a network state or whatever you want to call it. And the only way to really break out of these like physical territories and into these like digital territories is to have something to start building a system that exists independently of the sort of like geopolitical constraints that we're currently bound to, right? And yeah, to me, like the things that I'm excited about with crypto are the promise of building like, we were talking about digital maps in the beginning of this conversation, but really starting to like lay down that foundation of like, how do we start mapping that territory? How do we monetize that territory? How do we build a system and of institutions that can support that entirely new territory, whatever that is?
Yeah. Well, the area I'm most excited about there is funding our global public goods. So there's no nation state that, in America, we have people focused on our national defense, our national infrastructure, but there's no one focused on global coordination failures like AI alignment or open source software. I know you've done a lot of work on open source software, and we're just going to be able to scratch the surface of it here. But maybe that's the thread I'll pull, because my work at Gitcoin was focused on how do we use crypto to build global public good funding. And I know that that's a problem that you studied back in the early 2010s. And that's kind of where I think the place that crypto fits. And I wonder if you have any pushback or comments on that.
Not necessarily. I think I'm still trying to, and maybe you can help me understand this. I think I'm still trying to process the like, what are the learnings that came from essentially like monetizing open source, which I think a lot of the crypto and Web3 experiments made possible. From my vantage point, when I was looking at open source in sort of like, it was kind of like mid to late 2010s, I was standing with kind of like one foot in traditional open source world, let's call it, or like open source. I say traditional, but I just mean like open source that really wants nothing to do with crypto.
Right.
Uh,
Most
the
open
Git,
source.
yeah, most open source, unfortunately, right? And in the time that I wrote working in public and published that, I didn't include anything about sort of like that next generation because it was just starting, right? And then you see like all these experiments start to play out, and it was interesting for me coming in like a couple of years before then, where everyone is talking about funding issues in open source, and wouldn't it be great if we could support maintainers and have this more like sustainable system to support them.
Yeah.
And then the solution kind of comes along that is a little, different and out there, but like it is an interesting experiment. And I was sort of like elated and excited to see like, how would open source developers react to that. And the reaction was very, sort of like side-eyed, suspicious, and lukewarm. And the answer, I think, really just comes down to like they're two different cultures that mix like, oil and water. And but like, I think part of me, as being kind of more of an outsider, just looking at experiments, I was a little disappointed in that because I was hoping that there would be more cross learning between them. So I don't know, maybe just like turn the question back to you, but like, do you feel that there were learnings that came from all those experiments that like maybe traditional open source developers should have learned from, or do you have a different take as to like why those two cultures just like didn't mix at all?
Yeah. Well, my first comment, which is maybe a little bit of a shit post, is, oh, so there's two different cultures. If only someone was mapping out digital tribes, so we could figure out how they relate to each other. And look, yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh no, I said shitpost received. Got it.
Yeah, there you go. But what's the GDP of, let's call it Web 2 era open source versus Web 3 open source, and what are the cultural differences between them, and how do these two network states, which I'm using the word network state here, how do they trade with each other, and are they allied with each other? Is sort of the framing that I put that in my head. And from I guess I know that I'm known as like this Web3 guy and like this optimist guy, but I really think it's important to be adversarial when you're being optimistic. There are times where crypto has just fucked people over. I mean, look at FTX, 3AC. It's not popular right now. And I think that like the best thing crypto could do right now is channel talent and resources and capital from the degenerative projects, the things that blew up and caused people a lot of heartburn, into like the regen stuff, the stuff that's going to fund public goods, the things that are going to fund the commons in our communities. And I guess my first thing that I would say to someone who is outside of the crypto space, who might be an open source maintainer, is just don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. You get one bad website, you don't throw out the whole web. Same thing with crypto. If you get a couple bad crypto projects, don't throw out all of crypto. I mean, you could even actually argue that like 70% of crypto is trash, but I would still say don't throw away the 10% of people who are earnestly hardworking, trying to create a better future with the technology that they view as fundamental. And that would be sort of my starting framing. And I'm curious, what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, that is what I tell people. It is funny because I kind of see both worlds a little bit. Like, I will talk to people who are just, they think the whole thing is over at this point, and they're just like, see, those just like, it's not even a question in their mind. They've just moved on. And I'm just very surprised when I hear that. And I'll just kind of be like, yeah, I mean, to me, like weirdly, when a space is extremely noisy and when it is filled with a lot of skims, like that is actually a sign of its legitimacy, because people don't flock like crazy towards something that has zero opportunity in it. Like there's something interesting going on there. And I also just think like the talent ecosystem, because I'm always looking at like people and trying to understand like how like key people are, moving mountains. Like the fact that there is an entire separate and thriving like talent ecosystem that is dancing around these problems, to me says that like it's not going to just go away. There's something very interesting and different happening there. So yeah, I mean, I definitely share the view of like, there's always ups and downs, but my conviction has not changed whatsoever in crypto over the last couple of years.
That's great to hear. Yeah. And so, and then, so once we've gotten to a point of, okay, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, then I start telling people to look at how artists are monetizing their work in NFTs, and they're able to make more off of a single NFT than they do off of 10,000 Spotify plays, or how open source maintainers can receive hundreds of thousands of dollars from quadratic funding, retroactive public goods funding. Proof of Humanity has 10,000 people that are receiving UBI through it, and there's people in the global South who are living off of that. And for me, I like to just highlight the impact DAOs that I think are actually having positive impact. And hopefully we can, as we rotate the capital and attention and talent from the multi-billion-dollar projects that imploded, what are the ways that we can stimulate a more regenerative crypto ecosystem and people who are actually having impact and make the market actually reward that is kind of where I spend my time. So, I'll be curious if you have any reaction to that. I know you're not deeply in the space, but any advice for us or any comments on that?
No, I'm not sure anything sort of like pops out. I do.
Okay.
Yeah. I do wonder like if how much, like, yeah, I think maybe just going back to the, like, I think these are just parallel worlds that are just going to continue to develop in parallel. And I'm not sure how much like traditional open source is going to benefit from a lot of these new, like, I think it is that question of like, do you work with the existing system or you just like break it and build a new one? And I kind of feel like it's better in this case to just build the new system instead of trying to sort of like square peg round hole it. So I don't know. That's just something I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to get back to the Silicon Valley and New York Davos polarity in a second, but while we're camping on the crypto network state stuff, I just have to say that you wrote, I still haven't had a treatment of Balaji's network state thesis that resonates. And I'm wondering if we could unfurl that a little bit, because I think the network state decentralization thing is understanding your position on that is pretty key for me before we go back to the New York Silicon Valley thing. So why did you write that? And what about it? What would have to be true for the network state thesis to resonate with you?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I think like Balaji's entire set of views on the world is a little bit of this like noise thing we're talking about, where there's a lot to take in there. And I don't necessarily agree with everything in there, but like to me, the network state thesis has always had a seed of something that feels very important to me deep in my heart. And I think it does maybe go back to this like love of American values that I have, and my feeling that it sort of embodies it somehow, despite the fact that Balaji himself is very bearish on America and, left, he emigrated to Asia. And so he himself would not share that. But then when I read his work and I read the things that he says about network state, I can't help but feel that it's like touching on my heartstrings in that same sort of way. So yeah, I really wanted to find a way to reconcile this feeling of, I don't necessarily agree with everything in the network state or about the network state thesis in its most literal form, but there's some part of it that really resonates strong with me that I just like deeply believe. And I think it is this evolution that we were talking about of, going through these different I mean, even before America, you have like the British Empire, which was like the dominant place where, culture was built and disseminated. And then you had America as this colony that broke out that no one really thought much of or didn't take very seriously until like well into the Industrial Revolution, well into the 20th century, where America just had to like create all that itself. And that's happened once, right? And it can happen again. And yeah, I think there's something with sort of like the digital revolution then where like it's happening, but it's happening slowly, where I don't know what that next iteration looks like, but I feel like America, the nation state, is ready to evolve into like whatever that next form is. And so, yeah, that's why I wrote the piece, just to sort of parse that out. I think I'm less compelled by sort of like specific instantiations of networks. I think it takes a lot of gravitational pull to create a new network state. And I don't think that will be created around sort of like personal preferences or lifestyle choices or things like that. But I think wherever, like at any point in global history, there will be some reference point. Like I was saying earlier about how like you go anywhere in the world, like people understand what America means. Like maybe it won't be America, the United States of America anymore at some point, but it will be something else. We always need that like point of like shared hope or belief that there is like a place you can go where that is true. And so, yeah, I think there's some insight there around like what that next stage could look like.
Beautiful. Yes. great to hear sort of how you digest the concept and in your criticism of it. And I don't know, maybe it'll be our goal to get you out to a public goods network state at some point over the next 20 years. But anything else to say about crypto or network states before we jump back to the New York Silicon Valley dichotomy?
Nope, I don't think so.
Okay. I'm wondering if you could steelman and strawman the argument for the New York Davos and the Silicon Valley worldviews. Is that a fair ask? That's just how I think about it in my mind, like steelman and strawman for both polarities.
Yes and no. In the sense that, like, I don't think to me, it's just like history is moving forward, right? So it's like, to me, it's not about like one is better versus the other. I actually think like the Davos mindset was really perfect for a certain time in history. It was perfect for the end of the 90s, early 2000s, not dissimilar to sort of like the early promise of open source and how that has sort of evolved and changed over the last 20 years. There's a time for it. And now I just think we're in a different time and it's clearly not resonating with anyone anymore. So we just need to come up with something new. So in that sense, I don't think either worldview needs to be sort of like defended or not. I want to observe what is happening. And I kind of feel like it's almost like a descriptive thing of like, I think we're just moving into a new era. The cases that I will make for on both sides is I do think Silicon Valley still has a lot to learn from the Davos elite in terms of what to do well. I think the Davos playbook was like good in that they understood the value of, and it took time, but they understood the value of like building allies and relationships across all these different sectors of public society. And they understood that, if you want to get things done in politics, you need to make friends with people in government. You need to build a network of journalists and academics who like understand your values, right? And what I see on the sort of like Silicon Valley side of things, specifically sort of like the county, I shouldn't really say Silicon Valley because it's sort of like a subset of that, but I see a lot of people that are upset at the status quo who kind of define themselves in opposition to the status quo. But I think like everyone is still really stuck in this idea that like startups are the way and like the way that we spread our values is by building more businesses that just break institutions or embody those values, but not understanding that like tech also needs allies in all these different sectors. And I think this speaks again, maybe, to this sort of like intangible value of public goods and of the public sector that like is often misunderstood by people that are just like hyper focused on business. That it doesn't matter if you build the biggest, literally like biggest companies in the world. In the tech backlash, we're sort of beaten down by like regulators and by the media, and people thought Google was untouchable for so long, and then suddenly it sort of just has to comply with and be at the mercy of people that it was once maybe more in like opposition to. So I think like businesses are not infallible unless like that alone does not really change things. And I think the Silicon Valley story kind of proves that out. You need to understand how to like build relationships with other pieces of the public sector and think about these sort of like intangible public goods in sort of like media or academia and government to actually spread what you care about.
It's sort of an interesting framing. Your framing of Davos being sort of in decline and of the 90s and Silicon Valley being ascendant and of the 2020s kind of reminds me of this idea of the fourth turning. Ray Dalio's most recent book about the changing world order and just how empires rise and fall. And so that's the mental model that came up in my head. And I guess I'm just wondering, A, is that a fair mental model to have? And B, in like 10, can you paint us a picture of like if current trends continue, current course and speed, how does the world differ in 10 years from now? Let's say I invite you back on the GreenPilled podcast in 2033, and Silicon Valley has continued its ascendance, tech has continued its ascendance. Can you paint me a picture of that?
Yeah, I'll start with the first part. The framework where things kind of finally clicked for me was Carlota Perez's Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital, where she describes how like new technology leads to sort of like growing financial interest and participation, and then there's sort of like this crazy noisy frenzy period, and then there's a crash, and then like at some point the sort of ascendants overtake the incumbents, and they start to set their like cultural norms in place. They start to spread their influence on the world, and then eventually the cycle begins again. And she sort of maps this pattern happening across like industrial revolution or auto revolution. She kind of stops at the information revolution. I'm not sure that she would necessarily agree with my characterization of what is happening right now, but that framework of like new technology drives, like in simplified terms, a ton of money being made, and then the people with a ton of money now have this power that they need to defend and answer for. And the sort of like defensive reaction to that is to say, okay, what do we actually stand for? And I think you see this kind of playing out almost exactly with what happened with startups, where like pre-2016, everyone loved tech, everyone loved startups. And then something flipped. What flipped was, I think, like tech started to become powerful enough to become a threat. And then there was like this strong backlash. And now there's sort of like a struggle for power happening that I hope that the sort of like Silicon Valley mindset will emerge from, and sort of like take its place as sort of like the next stewards of public society. So yeah, I mean, I think like in 10 years, if that goes well, then I would hope that tech builds a lot more friendships and relationships outside of its own industry, and doesn't just see itself as yet another industry player, as, you know, yet another business sector. I hope that they learn the importance of, I would love to see like, you know, I would love to see mainstream books that like published by large publishers that actually tell stories about tech that are accurate and interesting, and not just sort of, you know, I think like most of the tech books we have now are still, they're like business books, right? Or it's about sort of like founders, or it's about failed founders or scammy founders, or like it's just like sensationalized stuff that it doesn't actually really spread the values of tech. It's just sort of like regurgitating or like reanimating this like zombie corpse that has not really changed very much over the last 20 years. It's like the same archetype and story that's being told over and over again. I would hope that we see more like tech-friendly politicians, because right now we really don't have that many. And we've seen just sort of like, you know, embarrassing examples of this over and over again, that the people that are making policy like don't understand tech at all. So yeah, I would just hope to see a much more optimistic picture of that in 10 years, that that shows that those values are being encoded into more places than just in startups.
Okay, amazing. Well, I'm wondering if there's anything I didn't ask that you want to say.
I don't have anything that comes to mind.
Okay. Well, I really enjoy your blog, Nadia.xyz. So I hope you continue putting out content and publishing. And I think you have this really sort of articulate way of describing trends in society and in the world that I've learned a lot from. I'll put a link to your blog and the book that you wrote about working in public in the show notes, and definitely would recommend those to everyone in the audience. And you know, thank you for everything that you do, Nadia. I think you're an inspiration to a lot of us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right. Cheers.
Cheers.